All right, today I want to talk about the final stages of capitalism. And you hear a lot about that from kind of the fringe left that doesn't get a whole lot of attention in the mainstream. There's kind of somewhat of an assumption that, somewhere around the late 1700s, early 1800s, around the Industrial Revolution, that humans discovered this form of political economy known as capitalism that was so perfect that it will last forever. And studying history, that just kind of naturally seems absurd because every form of political economy has a birth, a growth, and an end. So I wanted to talk about, what the final stages of capitalism look like. Are we there? And what should we make of it? And kind of the sections I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start off with the story of contradiction. Then I'm going to talk about the logic of late capitalism. I'm going to discuss what Marx said on late capitalism. I'm going to discuss the relationship between late capitalism and postmodernity or postmodernism. I'm going to talk about the effects of consumption and investment. I'm going to talk about hypercapital is my word for it. Marx called it fictitious capital. We're going to talk about freedom and the dictatorship of capital. We're going to talk about capitalism as a death cult in its late stages. We're going to talk about the coronavirus as a catalyst for kind of the final stages of capitalism, and then the end game for all of this. So first of all, a story of contradiction. I just want to paint a picture of you, create a little bit of a scene. Imagine a family, husband, wife, 2 children, go out to dinner. And, it's a wealthy family, and they go out for a nice dinner, and it's a 7-course meal. And I'm not going to go over everything they eat, but just, for starters, their appetizer, they want to get something nice, so they get each of them get a very rare truffle, and the truffle costs $95,000 each. So they each get one of those, and then they get the husband and wife. They're trying to take the edge off after a long day, and so they get a couple of margaritas. Each margarita costs $1,200. And then for the main course, they get steak. It's Wagyu beef. I don't know how you say that. It's basically cows that are fed a better diet than most humans. And they're constantly massaged throughout their life, so it produces the most tender beef in the world. And they eat steaks of that, as their main course. Then for dessert, they each have a piece of cheesecake with gold dust on it, and that's $2,000 a slice. Okay, now picture this family. They walk outside of the restaurant, and without even really paying attention, they all step over a homeless person, and they kind of go on their way. Now focus for a second on the homeless person. The homeless person doesn't have anything to their name. They could never, ever enter that restaurant. And they got their last meal by digging through a dumpster for food that was thrown out. Okay, that's, when I talk about this, I want to completely remove, just for a second, any notion of economics or political economy. I want to remove any notion of morality or anything like that, just trying to make as little of a judgment call as possible on this situation, on this scenario. Something about this has to strike you as odd. Something has to strike you about this as strange or weird, or something has to be unusual about this. And in order for you to either see this as normal or just not pay attention to it, there has to be devoted an incredible amount of energy and resources to making you not think about it. It's in the words of someone like Noam Chomsky, these ideals of human empathy have to be beaten out of a person. And I don't mean physically beaten out. I mean, mentally beaten out. We have to create a narrative and create a story as to why this scenario is okay. Not just okay, from a moral sense, from a legal sense, from a societal sense, from a sense of, what is best for everybody. We have to create a story, a compelling story as to why this is okay. Okay, so next up is why the logic of our system is failing. So what is the logic of our system? Well, there's one aspect of it is social mobility. So another word for this is the American dream. And the American dream, there's a couple ways of describing it. One is if you're born poor, you can work hard and advance to the middle class. Another way is saying if you're not so well off, you can work hard and save up and create your own business and be a small business owner. So just tackling a couple of those things in terms of like the facts around the logic of our system. The United States has the lowest level of social mobility, upward social mobility, the lowest level of upward social mobility in the developed world. I heard one economist joke that the American dream is more alive and well in Denmark, but it's dead in the United States. And that's very true. Denmark has, and all the Scandinavian social democracies, and to a lesser extent, all of Europe, plus Japan and South Korea, far higher social mobility than in the United States. So next aspect of social mobility, can you, if you don't have money, rise up and start your own business? And of course, there's all these Horatio Alger style success stories that are supposed to be really inspiring to us. Think someone like Oprah, who was born poor and now she's a billionaire. And, part of it is meant, it's theoretically meant to be inspiring, but what it really is a tool of the system is meant to beat you down and shame you for not being as successful as Oprah. So what's the reality behind that? Again, with the social mobility, we have an incredibly low level of people coming from nothing and starting their own business. The number one indicator of whether or not someone is going to become an entrepreneur, and there's different ways of wording this, and you see it differently in different publications. In the business press, so like Forbes would say the number one indicator of an entrepreneur, they would say something like whether or not they have access to liquidity. And it's kind of a vague term that it's meant to be worded in such a way. Another way is access to capital. And it's meant to be worded in such a way so that you don't understand it. There are other publications a little bit more independent, like Quartz or smaller publications like that say more bluntly, the number one indicator of whether or not you'll be an entrepreneur is whether or not you come from money. And for a long time, people speculated, is there an entrepreneurship gene? Is there some kind of risk-taking gene that these people are just really special and really gifted, and of course they deserve all of the riches and wealth and rewards that are heaped upon them? Well, of course, the reality is that's nonsense. The reality is that these are people with some kind of a safety net to fall back on. You have some kind of inheritance from family. And, you basically have a couple options with that. You can just stick it in an index fund and you're going to get a 7% return on investment. So it pays to be rich and it costs to be poor. So that's just the reality of it. The best indicator of what social class if you're going to divide up class into 5 categories, into quintiles, the best indicator of what class you're going to die in, more than anything else, is what class you were born in. So if you're born poor, you're probably going to die poor. If you're born rich, you're probably going to die rich. And this is kind of seen as an inevitability. And you hear jokes about it. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But we just kind of brush it off, typically. It's just kind of seen as just, how the world works. Okay, another aspect of the logic of our system. Hard work equals success. Okay, so let's return to our story of contradiction that I started off with. You know, you have the family that's eating this multi-$100,000 one meal, and you have, in the same physical geographic location, the same society, under the same laws, and, same political economy, everything's, fairly similar. The homeless person is digging out of a dumpster to get their meal. So by the logic of our system, we would assume that this family is very hardworking, very industrious, and very productive. And that the homeless man, or the homeless woman, whatever, is lazy, unintelligent, incapable, things like that. Well, let's look at how these people are productive in a market system. So there's a very high likelihood that the breadwinner of this family, we typically assume it to be the man, but it very well could be the woman, that the breadwinner of this family is more than likely in finance. Now, that's a word that's meant to be vague, and it's meant to distract you, and it's meant so that you don't understand what's actually going on. What that means is that is a person who owns things rather than does things. This could be a hedge fund manager who essentially gambles on other people's labor. What I mean by that is a person who they either buy stocks for a very short amount of time and then sell them, basically betting that a company is going to do better, or they short stocks, which means it's kind of a little bit complicated, but it means that they're basically betting on the value of this company to go down. So they're basically, it's kind of like Vegas, except for while Vegas, the odds are in favor of the house, on Wall Street, the odds are in favor of the investor. So it's like Wall Street is like Vegas for people who don't like risk very much. Because, the reality is, even if you do fail, oftentimes, throughout history, especially in the last 40 years, we have what's called bailouts. So if you go to Vegas and you lose $1,000, you're out $1,000. If you're on Wall Street and you lose $1 billion, well, you can pretty easily get that replaced. And we're going to talk about how you do that and what the mechanism is for that in just a second. So now to the homeless person. What does he or she do? Well, another kind of a slang term for a homeless person is a bum. And that is meant to suggest that this is a lazy person who doesn't do anything and relies for other people on a handout. Now, the reality is that over 40% of homeless people have jobs or recently had a job. So let's say, there's a number of things this person could do, but I'm just, for an example, going to say they work in construction. So the homeless person works to physically build the world around us, while the financier, the person eating the $95,000 truffle, does nothing to develop the real world around us. So this idea that hard work breeds success, the logic of that is failing. So the third one in terms of the logic of the system is that capitalism delivers the goods. Now, there is actually some level of precedent for this. Capitalism did deliver the goods. We can say, and we can choose different periods of time, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to choose between 1933 and 1979. Capitalism was very good, in America at least, probably the best in the world, at delivering the goods. And what I mean by that is that, say, from the end of World War II, 1945, around that era, to mid-1970s, every quintile of the economic spectrum, to the lowest 20% all the way up to the highest 20%, everyone doubled their standard of living. It was an incredible time of egalitarian growth. Everybody got better off. Okay, so there was a time when that was the case, and there's a lot of places you can go to and discover why that's not anymore. Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine does a good job explaining why we're no longer like that. David Harvey's A Brief History of Neoliberalism explains why we're no longer like that. So those are some good resources to check out. But capitalism no longer delivers the goods. And we can debate about what time this happened. The debate about it is somewhere between 1973 and 1979, the egalitarian growth stopped. So what that means is that the rich continued to get very, very richer, but those in the middle stayed the same. And that's adjusted for inflation. They didn't move anywhere. And those at the bottom got worse off, actually. So if you look at, I think it's from 1990 to today, the top 1% of Americans have gained $21 trillion in wealth, while the bottom 90% has lost about $900 billion in wealth. And that's according to Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. So this idea that capitalism delivers the goods, it no longer really holds up. Now there's this kind of alternative perspective. Capitalism doesn't necessarily deliver the goods like it used to, but you still have some level of choice that you wouldn't have in another society. And, they point to like the Soviet Union when it broke up. The United States sent a bunch of pro-capitalist, Harvard-trained economists led by Jeffrey Sachs to specifically Russia. And he basically went to the people and he said, y'all want blue jeans? And they said, yeah, of course we want blue jeans. He said, you want McDonald's? They said, yeah, of course we want McDonald's. And so he developed this package. And to his credit, Jeffrey Sachs has really done a 180. He actually supported Bernie Sanders in 2020. But back in the 90s, he was like a hardcore neoliberal. And he developed this incredibly austere recovery package for Russia that basically made them, privatize their entire economy, deregulate, slash taxes, the typical ordeal of neoliberalism. And it crashed their economy even worse than it was. And, most of Russian society, minus a few at the very top, but most of Russian society got substantially worse off. Russia is one of the few cases in the world that's ever abandoned universal health care, and the result was their longevity of life dropped dramatically. So there's that, and we can talk about what does deliver the goods mean. Does it mean I can go to the corner store and buy a bag of Cool Ranch Doritos, or does it mean that I can have a 20 years longer lifespan? What does freedom mean? And people are beginning to question that. All right, now I want to talk about what Marx said about late-stage capitalism. And he didn't use those words, but he talked about basically the end of capitalism. So one of the things, and this one is somewhat lighthearted, but it's kind of sad as well. Marx predicted that in the end of capitalism, everything will become a commodity. And I want to highlight a couple different things. One is like the absurd commodity. One is the sacred commodity. And one is the counter-revolutionary commodity. So the absurd commodity, you would think of things like, I think it was in the last year that Gwyneth Paltrow, whatever her company is, released a candle that she claimed was scented like her vagina. So that's kind of an absurd thing that a society based on need would never think to produce that. But because capital is so hungry for returns, it drifts into the absurd. Another thing, the commodification of the sacred. Nothing is sacred under capitalism. Everything is commodified. And the example I will use for there is pornography. Pornography, throughout history, throughout different cultures, sex is seen as a sacred act. Under capitalism, it is a commodity. We've exchanged both this idea of, kind of a reproductive act as well as an act of human connection. We've taken that, individualized it, and commodified it. So that's one example there. The last one is the counter-revolutionary commodification, and the term, I believe it was coined by the historian Thomas Frank, is the commodification of dissent. And there's a couple ways you can look at that. I'll start with some kind of somewhat lighthearted ones and get more serious. Think the idea that you can go on Amazon, one of the largest companies in the world, very profitable, a huge conglomeration of wealth, and you can buy a Che Guevara t-shirt, a capital of Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1, 2 or 3. In fact, if I'm being honest, I spend a lot of time in local bookstores. I've never seen Capital Volume 2 or 3 outside of Amazon.com. You can also buy Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's Manufacturing Consent. The most dissenting voices we've managed to turn into commodities. And we blow that up on a big scale. Think about the fact that Barack Obama, in the last few years, bought a $12 million house at Martha's Vineyard. And when we think about Barack Obama was not a rich man, even in Congress, and he writes these books and, makes some money, essentially selling hope and change, commodifying hope and change. And, since he's left office, he's been going around actually even beating Hillary Clinton. I think she gave $200,000 speeches to big investment banks. Barack Obama's been giving $400,000 speeches to big investment banks. He's turned himself, or the movement he allegedly tried to inspire, into a commodity, and it's paid off very well. His family's living very well. I think his daughter's at Harvard right now. It's obviously working out for them. But these things that some of us hold to as sacred, this idea of revolutionary change in the direction of justice, was turned into a commodity. So the next one that Marx predicted in the end game of capitalism is that capital will cannibalize society. So let's look at that. According to Marx, capital was going to search out every market or something that could be turned into a market in society. And according to Marx, his end game was that capital would end up cannibalizing the state. Lenin kind of expounded on that in his book, Imperialism is the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in saying that capital will not only, cannibalize its own society, but it will through war making. And I think we can expound on Lenin's idea is to go with kind of a Michael Hudson idea that it's really not even mostly about actual bombs and missiles and guns anymore. It's about financial warfare carried out by institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. So we look at Marx's idea that capital would cannibalize the state. So I think that was shown incredibly well in 2008, and it's being shown again right now in 2020. We have this idea that industry must be saved, and so we need to give them a bailout. So we indebt our society, the allegedly public aspect of our society, and prop up the private aspect of our society, capital. And, Noam Chomsky, back in the 80s, had a joke that he liked to tell about this. And he says, yes, these businessmen are these rugged individualists who are these, pioneers and titans of industry until there's some kind of collapse, and then They pick up their copies of Hayek and Friedman and Rand and run to the nanny state for a bailout. And that's true. As much as they pretend to be tough guys, they are completely reliant on daddy government. So there's another point I wanted to touch on that. Not only does capital cannibalize society, other societies, and the state, capital, we've seen in recent years, in essence, cannibalizing itself, like capital eating itself. And what I mean by that is, you have CEOs and board of directors and people like that whose compensation packages, all the executives, their compensation packages are tied to short-term stock price. So 100% or nearly of a CEO's incentives are tied to what the stock price will be either in the next quarter, in the next year, something like that, something very short term. And they're sacrificing the future of their own companies to raise stock prices in the next quarter. And one of the big ways they do that is through stock buybacks. And we look at like the airline industry specifically, kind of several things coming together here. Over the last 10 years or so, the airline industry has used 90% of its profits to buy back its own stocks. And this is not at all unusual for big companies. And for a second, I want to look at I don't want to be like a hardcore anti-capitalist and an ideologue. I want to look at what is capitalism at its best. What could capitalism possibly be that is truly beneficial? And I think there you'd have to go to somebody like Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett says every once in a while you can buy back your own stock if you do a calculation and you find out that your stock is seriously overvalued. So for an example, and if you don't know what this means, I'll try to explain it. Berkshire Hathaway, which is the company that it's a company that really invests in other companies, and it's headed up and has a large amount of ownership by Warren Buffett, and he's kind of widely considered to be like kind of the greatest capitalist to ever lived in terms of the level of return on investment he produces. No one in history has ever matched him. He's created this incredible company. And a few years ago, he bought back some of its own stock. And, I think some people criticized him for it. But from a strictly capitalist point of view, it actually made a little bit of sense. Their stock was seriously undervalued. It was something like a 10 or 11 to 1 price to earnings ratio. What price to earnings ratio means is if you were to divide up the total earnings and put it into each number of stock, what would that ratio be? And so basically like a 10 to 1 price to earnings ratio would mean you would get your investment back fully in 10 years. It's not quite, it's a little different than that, but I think you get the idea. So that's Berkshire Hathaway, this extremely stable, value-based company. Now, many of these other companies, like the airlines, they were already overvalued. We're talking price to earnings ratio of 20 to 1, 30 to 1, stuff like that, and they're still buying back their own stocks. Even from a strictly capitalist perspective, it's pure insanity. And there's Warren Buffett's mentor was this guy. He was an investor that kind of really took hold during the Great Depression and the time after. He said, you probably shouldn't invest in a stock if it's over a 10 to 1 price to earnings ratio. And we have stocks that people are still pouring money into. I haven't checked it lately. I'm not sure what the stock market's at recently. But you had stocks like Netflix and Amazon, the FANG stocks, that were trading at like 280 to 1 price to earnings ratio. Just absurd numbers. And it's purely based on hype, not based at all on productivity. So we have this argument, again, returning to the logic of capitalism, that it's based on productivity. But when we look at the reality, a lot of our economy is purely based on speculation. So that's where I wanted to leave off with Marx. Now I want to talk about how late capitalism relates to postmodernism. So there's a Marxist critic named Frederick Jameson who wrote a book called Postmodernism, The Logic of Late Capitalism. And he's kind of basically saying that postmodernism is a product of a society that it attempts to critique. And I think we could say that also about Jameson, or about pretty much all of us, because we're all a part of a society, and I guess some of us try to critique it. But I think in capitalism, particularly the late stages of capitalism, it goes far beyond that, because capitalism consumes and transforms everything in the world around it. It takes natural resources and turns them into commodities. It takes human value and human dignity and turns it into a commodity. It takes the sacred and turns it into a commodity. So there's that aspect. There's a tremendous philosopher from the 1990s. His name is Ric Roderick. He's passed away since. But he had this idea that when capitalism reaches a certain level of accumulation, commodities begin to detach themselves and form images. And this really draws from a couple of different thinkers, both French. One is Guy Debord, who wrote a book called Society of the Spectacle in 1967, and another one named Jean Baudrillard, who wrote a book called Simulacra and Simulation in the 1990s. And it's this idea that Roderick says that postmodernism in its essence is a blurring of the lines between reality and image. And just a couple examples on that. Actually, before I get into those examples, I want to contrast that with something Naomi Klein has said in her book, No Logo. She said that people, once they reach a certain level of accumulation, transcend a part of, she didn't use these exact words, but in essence, they transcend their humanity and become pure brand. Kind of applying the ideas of Roderick and Klein together, we can think of how Donald Trump, a reality star, a spectacle, became the literal, governing president of the United States. And that's not at all new. Barack Obama, this, I'd like to call him a simulacra of a revolutionary, a copy of a revolutionary that never existed. Barack Obama, before he took office, won a major award from the marketing industry for Marketer of the Year. In other words, it doesn't matter what he actually did, it matters what he sold. And he sold hope and change, and we've already talked about that. We can look back. Ronald Reagan was an actor. He was a spectacle, and he became our governing president. It doesn't matter, what his policies were. His policies were deeply unpopular even as he was governing, but he himself, as a spectacle, was incredibly popular. He won blowout victories in 1980 and 1984, even as he was running on incredibly unpopular policies. And we see this with other people. Michael Jordan, Klein says, transcends his humanity and becomes pure brand. Bill Gates, Tiger Woods, they're more brand than they are person, in a sense. To use the words of Obi-Wan Kenobi, more machine now than man. There's this other idea that Roderick proposes when he's describing the modern stages of capitalism. And he says that it is like our society has become a machine that meets your needs. And let's give a couple examples of that. Let's say I have a need that is hunger, and I want to meet that need. So I could, and I want to meet it in a way that I can afford, that's very affordable. So I could go to the convenience store and for a fairly low price, I could get a bag of Doritos. They have the crunch that I like, that artificial seasoning that really stimulates my taste buds. I can get a number of snacks that are all completely artificial, that in essence hijack my brain and trick me into thinking, this is satisfied. If we look into evolutionary psychology, this comes from at least back to our primate days, when a primate, let's say they climb to the top of a tree and they taste a fruit that is so sweet, the sweetness indicating, that this is something healthy, this is something that's going to give you nutrition, you need more of this. And we've developed that idea. So now fast forward to the modern stage of capitalism. Imagine eating a Snickers. Now a Snickers is far sweeter than a piece of fruit, but the way you're wired, it tells you, this is the sweetest fruit in the forest, you need more of it. So that it's hijacking your brain again. Another aspect, I have sexual urges. I have sexual needs. And not just sexual, I have needs for human companionship. So the difficult way to go about that is to date and find a mate and a partner. We've commodified that into a far easier way in the form of pornography. I can have a simulated human connection and satisfy both my needs for connection and my sexual urges through pornography. We've commodified what was once sacred in human sexuality. And Roderick says, this machine will meet any of my needs except the need to turn the machine off. The machine cannot meet that need, and it will fight you to prevent you from meeting that need yourself. Okay, the next section I want to talk about consumption and investment. So this idea is, what do you do with all that cash? I remember watching a YouTube video of Chomsky, reading this article from Business Week, and he says the headline is like, the problem in business today, what to do with all that cash, and it's just, to a person who is what you might call cash deficient, a headline like that is almost difficult to process because it's so absurd I can't wrap my head around it. To give you an idea, I've never worked for a wage higher than $13 an hour. And so I have no conception really of amounts of money higher than in the thousands. I really don't have any conceptual understanding of what $1 million is. The idea of $1 billion, it's, beyond anything I can think about. When we think about Jeff Bezos worth over $100 billion, those numbers mean nothing to me. And it's hard to even comprehend. And so I wanted to talk about, what commodities do you buy when you run out of things to buy and you've met all your needs and you've met all your wants and you've met all of the things you didn't even really want, but you bought them anyway. Again, we return to the story of contradiction. You can buy absurdly expensive foods, not to meet any kind of need, not any kind of physical need, but a social need that says, I'm the type of person that can afford a $95,000 truffle, Wagyu beef, and a gold-dusted piece of cheesecake. That's, in some sense, meeting a social need rather than any kind of physical need. And it's a social need to feel more important than your fellow humans. But even then, think about this. If you have $1 billion, if you're investing very conservatively, you would get a 3% return on interest, dividends, things like that. If you're, moderately conservative, you can get a 3% return on interest, dividends, things like that, plus a 4% capital gains. That's the average you would get from an index fund, which is, considered a fairly safe investment. So what that would produce is about $30 million a year without doing any kind of work. And to someone like me, it seems incomprehensible how you would spend $30 million a year. And I think to these people, it is also, in a sense, incomprehensible what to do with all that cash. So you say, well, you can buy a yacht. Well, could you buy a second yacht? Well, I don't know. I don't really use the first yacht all that much, to be honest. Could I buy a seventh home? I mean, it's been like a year since I even visited my fourth home. They're all mansions, they're all nice, but I mean, I can only stay at one place in one time. I bought the nicest car I can buy, but I mean, I could afford hundreds of cars, but I really only need to drive one. I mean, like, what do you buy? So the answer is you recycle those dividends and interest into further investment, so that after a time you're not worth $1 billion, you're worth $2 billion. Well, this presents even more of a problem. Now, instead of $30 million a year in cash, now you're getting $60 million a year in cash. And you have even more of a problem of how to spend this. But again, you have some level of human desires, human urges, and I want you to think about the difference between the piece of fruit that the chimpanzee eats at the top of the tree versus a Snickers bar. We've gone on to rather than meeting basic physical human needs or even social needs, we've gone on to attempting to meet needs of the absurd. And we can talk about examples about this. In the last year, there was an art show in which a banana duct taped to a wall sold for $125,000. For all I know, the person who bought that may have dropped $125,000 as a joke. Because money is essentially meaningless at that point. But what you can do is exchange money for power. And, looking here, we look back to, all of human history, this is true. But when it became true to really an absurd point, I think starts in 1971 with the famed Lewis Powell memo. Lewis Powell was a corporate lawyer for Big Tobacco, and he wrote a confidential memo that was later leaked to the Chamber of Commerce. And he said, listen, all these liberals are taking over. They're getting too much power. The young people, the hippies, the blacks, we need to put an end to that. So I encourage the corporate sector to use their financial muscle to suppress it. And the way that they suppressed it was by funding think tanks, buying out media institutions, buying nonprofits and charity. Think like the Clinton Foundation. So you have all of these kind of, you have the Trilateral Commission on the so-called liberal side. You have like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute on the so-called conservative side. And most of all, you got to pump money into politicians to make sure your guy wins. And that has been an incredibly successful counter-revolution. And if you're not quite understanding all of that, don't feel bad. The man who is considered the greatest intellectual alive, Noam Chomsky, said, I had no idea that this was coming. He talks about the counter-revolution that was basically opposing the New Deal and social democracy. He said, this completely blew my mind. I had no idea it was going to be this bad. But it is. Here we are. So once you've run out of actual things to buy to satisfy needs, once you've run out of things to satisfy any wants, once you've run out of things to satisfy any absurd wants, then you trade money for power. And that's what the wealthy have done. So next, I call this section hypercapital. Karl Marx called it fictitious capital. And essentially what that is rather than capital that is based around factory, plant, equipment, land, things like the physical things, we're talking about capital that is based on speculation. And, I talked about this a second ago. Think about the value of a company, say an airline company. What is the value of a company? We could look at price to earnings ratio. We could look at what is the value of all their assets, things like that. But the reality is in a lot of these companies, their stock price is being pumped up by CEOs who are just buying back their own stock on the open market. And that pumps up the price so that it looks good, and then they get, raises and so on and so on. Another way that we get fictitious capital or hypercapital is leverage. Let's just say leverage. So kind of the ideal way that finance is supposed to work is, let's say you have a bank. I mean, be generous to capital if we can. Let's say it's a community bank and you want to take out a loan for a small business. So the way it works is people put their money in savings in the bank and they get a small interest on that. And then the bank loans out money to you, and what they can do is they loan it out at a 10-to-1 ratio. That's pretty standard for a bank. So that means, they keep $1 in the bank and they give you $10. That's, 10-to-1 ratio. And we used to talk before the FDIC, there was back in the day, there's all these run on banks where banks didn't have enough cash to cover because, they were investing and they didn't have cash on hand. That's not so much an issue anymore. It could potentially become a short-term issue, but the Fed would pump liquidity due to the FDIC into the banks if there was any kind of an emergency, at least theoretically. So the idea that you used to have capital where, this community bank has an ownership stake, at least until they pay it off, in the land, in the building, and in the business itself of a small business in their community. Then you go on and you get these regional banks. And it's I live in Texas, for instance. So we're going to invest in small to mid-sized businesses all over the state of Texas. And then you've got these national banks. Think Wells Fargo and Chase and, Bank of America, people like that. And an important change in history is in 1999, I believe, the Clinton administration signed a bill called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that overturned a piece of New Deal regulation called the GlassSteagall Act. And what the GlassSteagall Act did was it separated commercial banks, where regular people just put their money for savings. It separated that from investment banks and speculation, people who were, trading stocks and hedge funds and all this kind of stuff. So that kept them separate. But in 1999, Bill Clinton signed, thanks to Congress as well, a law that overturned that. So you could merge these two big banks, a commercial bank and investment bank, and create a super bank. And now, think about this, everybody's money is FDIC insured, but it's being combined not just with this normal process of, what do they call it, fractional reserve banking, but they've combined it with speculation or fictitious capital, as Marx said. And so you had banks essentially leveraging multiple times over, kind of investment on investment, bet on bet with other banks, to where the level of assets was leveraged sometimes 40 or 50 to 1 as opposed to 10 to 1. So what that means is if your bank is leveraged 50 to 1, then if your investment loses 2%, you're wiped out. You're done. And that's essentially what happened when the housing market got wiped out, because it was essentially a lot of speculation. And you might hear words like CDO, collateralized debt obligation, or synthetic CDO. These are essentially bets on bets on bets centered around the housing market. But the actual assets that they had were far, far lower than the fictitious capital. Okay. Another one that I wanted to talk about is Vulture Capital. Now, kind of the face of Vulture Capital is a guy like Mitt Romney, who was head of Bain Capital. And essentially what Bain Capital does, and there's a lot of private equity firms like this, is there's a business that either they're in trouble or they're willing to sell or something like that. And somebody like Bain Capital will swoop in, cut a bunch of costs. And what that means in the real world is they fire a bunch of people, strip the company down to the bone. And then for a short period of time, it looks like the company's really profitable. And so they sell it at a higher margin. So, there's really no logic to this from a strictly pure pro-capitalist perspective, from an Adam Smith perspective, from a Benjamin Graham perspective, from a Warren Buffett perspective. There's no reasonable logical, I love capitalism way to justify this. The only way you justify with this is from the neoliberal perspective of, if there can be a market for it, there should be. And there is apparently a market for vulture capital firms, so therefore it is the right thing to do. I want to talk about, we talk about dictatorship, and we hear about these ugly, awful dictatorships. Think the Soviet Union, or Mao's China, or North Korea, or Castro's Cuba. And we think about those places, and we think that is a dictatorship, but we here are free. And it's a valuable question to ask. What is freedom? What does freedom mean? What kind of freedom do I want? And we could talk about positive and negative freedom, and talk about freedom from someone causing harm to me, or freedom to have access to things that make my life fulfilling. And here's, I think an example of how capitalism has gotten dramatically worse even in the last 40 years. So in 1979, Margaret Thatcher, kind of the female face of neoliberalism, the British Ronald Reagan, Thatcher takes office, and she knows something that our politicians today don't understand. And she understood that if you had some level of stake, some economic, physical, material stake in society, you are not going to rebel. You're not going to probably go on strike. You're not going to march in the streets. If you have, even if it's a small slice of the pie, if you have a slice of the pie, you're going to be pretty okay with that. And the way Thatcher kind of manifested this was, and she did it in a pretty shady way, but it was actually kind of smart politically, is she basically, in some ways, helped people buy their own home. If you weren't able to buy your own home and you're still a renter during that period, your rent doubled. So you're kind of screwed. But if you did buy your own home, chances are you voted for the Conservative Party the rest of your life. Because, the Thatcherites, gave you some level of significance in society, some level of human dignity. Thatcher knew, and I believe this is a quote from her, she said, the best defense against Bolshevism, kind of Soviet-style communism, the best defense against Bolshevism is home ownership. Now, contrast Thatcher with Barack Obama. Barack Obama takes office in 2009. He gives massive, unprecedented bailouts to big business and completely shafts homeowners. Home ownership dramatically reduced under Barack Obama's time. As much as, the right wing said Obama was too friendly to black people lost half of their wealth under the Obama administration. It was absolutely absurd. If you want to know why Occupy Wall Street happened, if you want to know why, Bernie Sanders twice happened, if you want to know, what that was all about, what did Thatcher know that Obama did not know, or refused to pay attention to? That having some level of peace, of ownership in society, makes you, more docile, more complying to authority around you. If you have mortgage payments, you're probably not going to go on strike. That's just a reality. So, that idea of freedom versus freedom of the market is a good comparison. The next one is I took from Chris Hedges of former Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times columnist. He's now with RT and Truthdig. He calls it the death cult of late capitalism. And I just want to, compare two figures. You hear a lot that America is a Christian nation. Christianity is, theoretically at least, a religion based on the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth said that if you really care about me, the best way to show it is to look out for the least of these. He said things like, the last will be first. He actually got aggressive and violent when people were trying to commodify the sacred. He took a bullwhip and chased money lenders out of the temple. So it's pretty clear we don't operate as a society under the principles of Jesus of Nazareth. But there was a deity around that time, a little bit earlier than Jesus, who does fit with our, kind of modern philosophy, ideology, and morals. And that was the ancient Canaanite god of Moloch. Now, Moloch was a little bit different than Jesus. Jesus said, there's no greater love than this, than a man should lay down his life for his friends. Moloch said, I will make you prosperous if you give me human sacrifice. And that is exactly how we operate in the United States of America. We slaughter 68,000 of our fellow citizens every year on the altar of prophets to please Moloch. It is in no way a human or humanitarian ideology. It is purely the pursuit of prosperity in exchange for human life. Next one I want to touch on is how the coronavirus will act as a catalyst to trigger the final stages of capitalism. So, you had a couple things happening. You had multiple Republican political leaders coming out, governors, senators, congresspeople, saying we need to be willing to sacrifice human life to get the economy jump-started again. And when they say the economy, they don't mean the economy broadly, like we had between 1933 and 1970s. What they mean is we need to get the stock market up so that the return on capital goes back to normal. That's what they're talking about by the economy. And by sacrifice, they don't mean themselves or their own family members, people who have plenty of money and access to good health insurance. They say, what they're essentially saying is we need to let the poor die off, this incredibly cynical, Malthusian, social Darwinistic idea that we can sacrifice a lot of poor people, particularly poor older people, on the altar of prophets so that we can, please Moloch and return to prosperity. Another way that coronavirus acts as a catalyst to trigger the final stages of capitalism is everybody in the mainstream, essentially, there's this idea called modern monetary theory, and it's essentially your level of debt does not matter in a society so long as growth outpaces debt. So long as growth outpaces debt and inflation, you're not going to have any problems and you're going to make society better off. And if you inject more liquidity into society more broadly, you're gonna have a better society. And everyone, from right-wing economists to someone as liberal as Paul Krugman, have said this is nonsense. You're going to get hyperinflation, And the crisis is proving that the modern monetary theorists like Randall Wray, like Stephanie Kelton, were right, and everyone else was wrong. And this is such a bipartisan schism that you have people like Bernie Sanders, chief economist, with Stephanie Kelton, one of the leading voices for modern monetary theory, and you have Marco Rubio, a prominent Republican senator, who's quoting Stephanie Kelton in his position papers. So this idea that we somehow debt is this huge idea. It's a fiction that's been created by bondholders, essentially. And everybody is realizing that in real time. You had a video even from 10 years ago or so, interview of Ben Bernanke, and they said, how can you just print all this money? And he just real casually says, we're not printing it. We're just adding zeros to different people's accounts. And the people who told us that this was impossible, was going to crash the economy, apparently now it's the only thing that can save the economy. So the logic of that is collapsing before our very eyes. So now I want to get, what is the end game? What is capitalism transitioning to? And there's different ideas on this. There's different ideas on the left and on the right. One of the ideas coming out of the Bernie Sanders movement is let's return to the New Deal era. Let's return to social democracy. And let's we had broad prosperity, we had good growth numbers, everybody was more content then. I mean, there's problems. There was definitely racial injustice, and I certainly think that one of the reasons for the reaction against the New Deal era was when black people got rights. There was a certain segment of upper class society that was perfectly fine with a welfare state for poor white people that were not so okay with the welfare state for poor black people. So I think that plays into account. So you got this kind of Bernie Sanders progressive movement that says, well, what if we return to social democracy, New Deal era politics, but make it more racially and gender inclusive? To be honest, I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. I voted for him in 2016. I think that's one of our best shots. But at the same time, there's something that is really unpredictable there, and that is capital flight and capital strikes. So a plan like this would only work if everybody agrees on it. And by everybody, I mean one of two things. Either capital agrees to keep their money here and pay a higher rate of tax and have more regulation, or we have capital flight where they go to Mexico, China, wherever, and make a higher rate of return over there. Another way to do it is harmonize all of these kind of laws between nations. So we get Europe and China and everybody say we're going to have a similar level of tax, we're going to have similar type of regulation, we're going to have similar type of labor laws, so the capital is not getting any kind of advantage by moving overseas. That's a nice idea in theory, but we can't even get other countries involved, on the same page of saving the earth from climate change. So the idea that there's going to be some kind of harmonizing agreement about, if some nation can get some kind of benefit from lowering their taxes so they get businesses moved there, they're going to cheat the system and run the game in their favor. So that's the downside to social democracy is, it's basically the state is not as powerful as capital is the gist of it. The other concept that you'll see very rarely, but it is a voice on the fringe left, is like kind of Bolshevism, Soviet-style communism, kind of a return to that. Basically a centralized command economy. And, as much as I hate to give credit here, give credit where credit is due, Ludwig von Mises had this idea called the calculation problem. And it's essentially that in a large, complex society, it is impossible to predict where goods and services need to go without a market pricing mechanism. And all the evidence that I've looked at from centralized command economies suggests that is an accurate assessment. Societies eventually collapse, but in the short term, there's shortages and things like that because you can't figure out what the proper price is, because rather than letting a market decide, you are trying to have some kind of central authority, some bureaucracy deciding prices. Now, theoretically, a centralized command economy could work if we have strong artificial intelligence. But A, that's a ways off, and B, it's completely theoretical. The idea from the right is reactionary nationalism, and this is what we see in the embodiment of Trump. It's like, okay, if people are going to go over to China, Mexico, wherever, let's just close our borders. This is kind of like social democracy. I mean, not morally, not economically, but it's like social democracy in the sense that, in a way, it's trying to turn back the hands of time to a period of time that no longer exists anymore. Capital is globalized, capital is fluid, capital can go anywhere, and, capital is bigger than the nation state. They can push you around. Either through capital flight, capital strikes, or by buying out Congress and making sure you can't do anything. So it's bigger than anything that the state or democracy is capable of handling. And I hate to leave it there on such a negative downer note, But I honestly don't have any good solutions. I don't know what to do. I'm certainly scared about the prospects for our future. But I'm at a loss. None of our options are very good, and it's looking rough on all fronts. So I hope I'm not going to say enjoyed, because this is kind of a pessimistic, podcast, but I hope you got something out of it. So, thanks for listening.